Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Global Business School Network webinar. Today, our topic is the future of globalization. We are being joined by Dr. Anil K. Gupta and Christine L. Thompson. But before we get started, I wanted to just go over some logistics. As participants during this webinar, you will be muted the entire time. Please feel free to submit any questions and comments at any time during the presentation using your Q&A function in the toolbar. Our CEO, Dan LeClaire, will be leading the Q&A portion towards the end of the webinar, so please stay tuned for that. So I'm going to turn it over to Christine L. Thompson. She is the Executive Director of Executive Education at the University of Maryland, Robert H. Smith School of Business.
Thank you so much, Nicole. We really appreciate your hosting Dr. Gupta and myself. This is a great topic and obviously very timely, and we appreciate very much the opportunity to spend at least a few minutes with you during your day. I'm also going to introduce another colleague of ours, Ms. Rebecca Bellinger, who is the Executive Director of our Center for Global Business. So she, myself, and Dr. Gupta here really do, again, thank you for hosting us at the Robert H. Smith School of Business today. Through the school's Center of Global Business, we are pleased to be active members of GBSN. The center is the hub of global learning and activity at the school and welcomes this opportunity to reconnect with you all, our partners, around the world. We appreciate everyone's time and hope you find this a valuable source of knowledge and perspective. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anil Gupta. Not easy to do. Dr. Gupta is the Michael Dingman Chair in Strategy, Globalization, and Entrepreneurship at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland at College Park, Maryland. He is ranked by Thinkers 50 as one of the world's most influential living management thinkers, and has been named by The Economist as a superstar for research on emerging economies. A member of the World Economic Forum's Global Expert Network, he is the author of several influential books, including The Quest for Global Dominance, Getting China and India Right, and The Silk Road Rediscovered. Dr. Gupta is also a celebrated professor, and he has earned countless teaching awards. I want to personally thank Anil for his support of this webinar today. Dr. Gupta will be presenting his material for approximately 25 to 30 minutes, and then we will move into a 20-minute or so question and answer period moderated by Dan, as Nicole mentioned. Please post your questions in the Q&A area, and Dr. Gupta and Dan will address them thematically during the Q&A time. So I now turn it over to Dr. Gupta. Anil, thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Rebecca and Nicole and Dan. So good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. So let me jump right into my topic. If we, just look at the headlines today, it appears that, even in the highly influential media, that there is an echo chamber where everybody is just essentially reading what and listening to what others are saying, and they only talk about the gloom and doom. If you just look at the headlines, is this the end of globalization? Foreign affairs. COVID-19 could bring the trading system down. How, to stop protectionism from running amok. The globalization, the coronavirus is killing globalization as we know it. So essentially, for me, the questions that I want to address here, is this the end of globalization? Or in fact, is it also a new beginning? And if we look first at what globalization, and here I talk about the old globalization, which is really connectedness by trade, trade in physical goods. So what it has done over the last, 100 years, in fact, if you look at, but just look at more recent data, life expectancy around the world, it's really the rise of emerging markets everywhere from low income to middle income, and of course, China, which is in the higher end of the middle income. If you look at just the reduction of poverty, just, over the last actually about 30 years, so you look at 36% of the world population used to live at less than $1.50 a day, adjusted for, in terms of real 2011 numbers. Today, that proportion is down to 10%, or actually less than 10%. But at the same time, what we've been witnessing is a horrendous side effect of all of this development, and which is really rising inequality and rising. So if you look inequality across countries at the global level, inequality has been coming down massively. The average Chinese, the average Indian, the average African is less poor as compared to the average American or the average German. But within country, and that's within US, within Germany, within UK, within France, within India, within China, inequality has been rising. If you just look at the US figure, the top 1%, how much of the total net personal wealth in the US, what is their share? That has been rising one might say horrendously. And so all of that, what it does is essentially this inequality feeds populism, this divide in terms of every aspect of divide. And this populism is what has been feeding nationalism. So therefore, the rising nationalism that we see is not a new development. This is something that has been going on for the last 30 years, 40 years, and this is something that we should all be concerned about. So this is what I would say, in some sense, the old ideological globalism, that has definitely taken a massive hit and is likely to continue taking a massive hit. So therefore, I don't want to minimize that part. But at this, so in fact, in some sense, if you look at the ideological side of globalization, that has already been taking a hit, and it's not likely to recover anytime soon. But let's look at another dimension of globalization, which is really the globalization in terms of merchandise trade. Because for the last 100 years, that is what economists have focused on when they talk about globalization. Okay, and that, if we look at, obviously, protectionism is on the rise today because of coronavirus. But, let's look at the last 20 years already. In fact, merchandise trade to world GDP has been in decline. And if we actually look not just the last 10 years, look at the last 30 years, the ratio of growth in merchandise trade at the global level to the growth in GDP used to be almost like a ratio of 3x 30 years back. Today, in fact, 2019, that ratio was already at 0. So therefore, these are long-term trends. They just get accelerated by coronavirus, but that's not a new development. And obviously, the current situation, the virus has made the situation far worse. But why has, over the last 30 years, and particularly over the last 10 years, the merchandise trade has been a declining, almost like on a glide path to history, end of the commodities boom, less demand for iron ore, less demand for oil, declining prices for both iron ore and oil, rising wages in emerging markets. So therefore, less need for essentially an arbitrage in wages between, say, US and China, or US and Mexico, or Western Europe to Eastern Europe, rising automation. So therefore, once again, less need for arbitrage in terms of wages, and rising e-commerce, which means faster response and shorter supply chains. So all of these put together are actually what have been killing really merchandise trade. And if you look at these trends, they are secular. They are not likely to revive anytime soon. I would say never, ever in the future. And then again, look at on impact of the current coronavirus situation on merchandise trade, because every country in the world is now adopting a risk reduction strategy. And here, what I mean in risk reduction at the national level in terms of national security, but then also risk reduction by companies. And so therefore, supply chains, instead of being distributed around the world, or in particular, focused a lot more on one country, which is China, the manufacturing powerhouse of the world, that countries now, as they move towards risk reduction, they are pulling back in towards, especially for the medical supplies or for semiconductor chips, tech, that pulling those supply chains back into their countries. So you look at action by Japan, you look at action by Europe, you look at action by India. Just a couple of days back, Mr. Modi said, in fact, his slogan is vocal for local, that we should actually, Indian citizens Indian companies should prefer to buy Indian. But what's interesting is what he also said, we welcome foreign investment, but we want companies from outside India to manufacture in India. So this is not closing the doors to multinationals, but indeed definitely discouraging imports and trying to achieve greater self-reliance in terms of manufacture. So, and if we, so again, picking up on the investment side, that, interlinkages across countries, they are not just by trade, but they're actually multidimensional. So if you look at FDI, that interlinkage has been growing. So merchandise trade declines, but investment grows. If you look at global interlinkages via services of all types, from transport and travel, of course, that has taken a hit. But you look at finance, you look at telecom, you look at consulting, education, entertainment, that's Netflix and Amazon Prime Video. All of that has been growing. So therefore, if we really look at what has happened in terms of the old globalization, is that merchandise trade is on a glide path to history and will not recover ever. From an ideological point of view, yes, the world is in trouble in terms of a lot more nationalism and populism rather than an embrace of globalism, if you will. But at the same time, notwithstanding all of that, what we need to do is to celebrate the rise of something much more powerful than all of these, which is what I call the new digital globalization. And so here is some data from McKinsey. If you look at over the last 15 years, actually, we could go 20 years, the average annual growth rate in terms of data flows is 50%, 51%. And you could do the compounding of that, within 5 years, basically the world turns upside down. Now you might say, does it really matter? If I have, talked to my friends and family members on WeChat or WhatsApp across countries, how does it really matter economically? And actually, it does profoundly. And that's what I want to talk to you, all of you about. But first, just look at, if you think of the world as a network, as a digital network, obviously the power, the massiveness of that network depends very much on what happens at the nodes. And just one important country to look at, India, that in terms of the digitization of India, so within India, monthly data consumption per unique connection from 2014 to 2018 went up by 100 times. That's not 100%, but 100 times. And the same story is playing out around the world. And obviously, no wonder that just 2-3 weeks back, Facebook invested $6 billion to power India's, the number one telecom operator, Reliance Jio. So what do we mean by data flows? Naturally, it is talking on WhatsApp or WeChat or Skype. So that's communication. But it's also collaboration among scientists, among engineers, dispersed around the world. It's also diffusion of ideas and technology. So therefore, let's say some AI algorithm gets developed at MIT or Berkeley, or at University of Cambridge, or at Tsinghua University. And those actually technological scientific developments diffuse around the world because much of science and technology, particularly science, is really public good. Also, data flows is the flow of digital goods and services. Music from Spotify or Apple or Amazon. And so that's video games, movies. So, if we look at, for example, on the communication side, that look at the share of users outside the home countries at Facebook or, WhatsApp or Twitter. If we look at the streaming, the share of, obviously, streaming is what goes global. It's much harder to actually globalize music if you are distributing it via, for instance, CD or music videos via DVD. But streaming, goes far more global, far more rapidly. And streaming's share of global revenues, music revenues, just 5 years back, 2015, used to be less than 20%. Now, actually, it's already in 2020. I'm sure it's more than 50%. And look at collaboration, and COVID-19 has brought this out, kind of almost like in your face about COVID-19 changes how the world does science and which is together. And do you think people are going to forget that once we are out of the virus? No way. This is like we are learning how to do science. And you just look at in this particular story about Pittsburgh and Paris and Austria, Norway, the Gates Foundation in Seattle, India. And so that's, just one example of hundreds of, about 200 such examples of how cross-border collaboration is happening. Look at open source, both open source in terms of data, but also open source of the science and technology that emerges, or algorithms that emerge from that data. So a lot of medicine has gone open source, and in fact, vast majority involves cross-border collaboration. Microsoft just recently has thrown its weight behind this whole open data movement that already had been going on for the last 20 plus years, but now has gathered pace. So these are examples of what I mean by cross-border data flows. And so, just look at of course, the rise of clouds, global clouds, whether it's Microsoft or, Azure or AWS or Ali Cloud. And so what does, in fact, this global cloud do? It makes factories more productive, because naturally, if it's factories scattered around the world, whether it's a Tesla factory or, a factory of Procter & Gamble, or a cement company like Holcim. So if they are factories distributed around the world, they share best practices, they share know-how. Through the global cloud, it makes them more productive. Look at offices, obviously, that's collaboration among scientists or engineers or just office workers in terms of how to market, how to sell. Look at colleges, e-learning. Time used to be when, in fact, I studied my undergrad in college in India, where you would have physical textbooks and new developments, new textbooks being developed by global experts somewhere outside the country. It would take years for that to filter down to my college. But today, you have Coursera and edX and MIT and Harvard, and all of that course material is available everywhere at the same time. And so therefore, essentially, with a lag of maybe 1 day or 1 week or 1 month, that professors in India are teaching the same thing that professors in the US or UK might be teaching. And of course, even individuals, so these days, for example, when I talk to my family members and friends in India and China, that I find that in fact, whether it's about coronavirus or about e-learning or it's about e-commerce, that they, in fact, because of this cross-border knowledge sharing, cross-border communication, that they are as up to date as anybody sitting here in Washington, D.C. And what that means is that it makes everybody more productive, whether it's factories, offices, colleges, individuals. So that's where the impact of the new globalization. This is from the media company, The Information. So it's not data-driven, but it's logic-driven chart, essentially. And yes, as you go from in-office to remote work, initially there is a cost of conversion, but eventually that remote work, is significantly less expensive. And once you go down that path, so let's say a company like Twitter, headquartered in San Francisco, and now you embrace remote work, people sitting not just in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley, but people sitting in New York or in Colorado or in Texas, etc. Once you figure out how to make that happen, that's no difference than, the next step is that your Twitter's employees are actually distributed around the world. So all this work from home revolution that we are currently witnessing, what it will do, it will lead to far more distributed work, not just distributed within countries, but distributed across countries. Time used to be when, because emerging economies were not very large, that if you wanted scale economies, that you needed to produce in some countries and then export to the smaller economies. But today, emerging economies are becoming large, massive. India is now the sixth largest economy in the world. Latin America, all of those are powering ahead. And as emerging economies become bigger, look at China, India, ASEAN as a region, that the need to produce in one country to sell in another country comes down, because now the scale of the local economy is large enough that you can produce local for local. So that's what I mean by, so if you look at the new era, even in the domain of manufacturing, that we will have multinationals, we will have companies like Tesla or General Motors or Toyota or Procter & Gamble or Unilever. But what we will see, this new era of globalization, is that you will have factories that are distributed around the world, production within major markets, which could be countries like China or regions like Europe or ASEAN, that you will have local for local or regional for regional production. But these factories will be connected by bits, by flows of course, capital, which again is information, but they will be connected by flows of technology, of know-how, of ideas, best practices, and that connected by atoms, not atoms, and by bits and not atoms. And that is what will make these factories a lot more productive. Changing of the structure of products. So, even physical goods, for example, like a wind turbine, the new era of energy. So when a wind turbine, let's say gets shipped out from Denmark, for example, to other markets, obviously there is merchandise trade. But at the same time, once the product is installed, there is the ongoing movement, sharing of software and digital services. Even a lowly product, if you will, like a sneaker, now is not just a hardware, but also software and services. So the hardware may get transported from one country to another, but it's not just the physical good, but then later on, it's the bits and bytes that flow on top of that. Naturally, an iPhone is not just a hardware, but software and services. Or Tesla car, once again, over the air upgrades that take place. So that's what, the nature of global trade is changing from just trade in physical goods, which is dying, to the cross-border flows of data. And now, this is kind of a really, really, really important slide. It's a McKinsey analysis. So does it all matter? And let me kind of take a minute to go through the logic here. So essentially, what we have, and this comes out of very sophisticated econometric analysis that I have looked at, and which I subscribe to. I think this is good analysis. And essentially, what these people have done, so they have looked at, in terms of a regression analysis, that the outcome variable, they have looked at GDP. But then on the contributing, the influencing factors, they have looked at trade in goods, trade, flows of data, of course, flows of people, flows of FDI, et cetera, et cetera. And then you look at year by year as the GDP changes, and as merchandise trade changes from one year to next, as data flows change from one year to the next, maybe they go up, maybe they go down, as people flows, etc. So in an econometric analysis way, what is the impact of these various, if you will, independent variables on the outcome variable, which is really GDP? One of the findings is that merchandise trade, yes, historically has been the largest contributor to GDP growth. But then the importance of that is coming down as merchandise trade itself is becoming less, let's say, more, just declining in terms of both volume and value. But at the same time, data flows, that was 2013, but today in 2020, the impact of data flows on world GDP is bigger than the impact of merchandise trade. And you look ahead for the next 10 years, data flows will continue to power ahead, but merchandise trade will actually wither away. So, and I mean, essentially, to look at it another way, that the old proverb about give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. teach him how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. So think about, merchandise trade among countries is almost like fish going from one country to another, okay? Whereas the new, which is era of digital flows, is the flow of ideas, technology, know-how. It's like, the know-how, best practices, is like how to fish. So therefore, what's being traded now between countries is how to fish and not the fish itself. And we know that, if you were to completely close Brazil, no imports, no exports of physical goods, but you permit the movement of capital, you permit the movement of technology and ideas. Yes, do we want a Brazil that's closed off or an India that's closed off? No. But even in that extreme case, if merchandise trade goes to hell, goes to zero, but you have data flows, technology flows, and all of that, the world will still actually not only survive, the world will thrive. It will thrive even more if there were no other kinds of barriers, imports and exports of physical goods were allowed. But at the same time, there is absolutely no logical or factual basis for bemoaning, and somehow worrying about the end of globalization as if the world has fallen apart. Far from it. People need to get out of their echo chambers. So to summarize, I would say the old globalization, and particularly the dominant form of the old globalization, which is merchandise trade, that is dying, and that's what people keep bemoaning about. But let's get out of it. And what we need to do is celebrate, embrace the new era of digital globalization, because nobody can stop this. Nobody wants to stop this, except in some cases, especially when it comes to news, information, media. If you talk about China, if you talk about Russia, but China and Russia, they're important countries. But taken together, they're still less than 20% of the world's GDP. 80% of the world's GDP is not China, not Russia. And the rest of that world is increasingly, in fact, at a rapid pace, getting connected by bits rather than atoms. So that is my story, my analysis, and I'd be very happy to engage in a discussion over the coming 25 minutes or so. But obviously, as we embrace this new era of digital globalization, it raises policy issues about data privacy, naturally, especially that if that concerns individual, identifying data. Europe has GDPR. India has been mulling over similar questions about data privacy. Not yet, in fact, countries haven't really figured out how to make this happen in terms of protect privacy, but not get into data nationalism. GDPR, has been only very moderately successful. So we need to, policymakers need to figure that out, and they're struggling with this. Related issue, data nationalism. There used to be the old proverb, that data is the new oil. But obviously, when it comes to oil, you can have nationalism. It's easy to imagine that. But how do you have nationalism regarding data? Technology nationalism, we know that in certain sectors, particularly semiconductors, 5G, AI, there is in fact a move by China, for example, to engage in technology nationalism, and that's also reflected in actions from the White House here in the U.S. So there is a rise of technology nationalism, IP rights, taxation. How do you tax digital goods? Europe has been struggling with that. France has been struggling with that. India has been struggling with that, and naturally cyber hacking. So therefore, I don't mean in the least to imply that digital globalization will be an easy thing. It raises its own new issues, but at the same time, and these issues will become important, but nobody, in my view, has the power, not the White House, not China, not Russia. Nobody has the power, except at the margins, to slow down this pace of digital globalization. Thank you. Dan, so very happy to get into a discussion.
Great, that was brilliant. Thank you so much, Anil, for walking us through not only a bit of history, but very much the future of globalization. We have a number of questions that have come in during the talk, but I'm gonna start us off if that's okay.
Yeah, indeed.
At the Global Business School Network, we, as you can tell from the title, care about the global flow of education. And you've mentioned education a couple of times in your presentation, but I'm wondering if you could flesh out for the audience a little bit more how you see this new globalization impacting, especially higher education as we move forward.
Yeah, so I think it's likely to be impacted in 2 or 3 ways. So one is the emergence of MOOCs. So, Coursera, edX, HBS has its own, Harvard Business School, HBSX. So emergence of these MOOCs. And, of course, one can get a MicroMaster's degree, but that is not the same as getting, let's say, an MBA or an MS or even a Bachelor's of Science degree. But, a lot of people, they don't necessarily care about credentials. And so if you care about learning, if you will, and you don't care so much about credentials, the market share of, on campus and even online on campus, like I'm teaching by Zoom this semester, that market share is declining and will continue to decline. And as the MOOCs increase their share, that's naturally cross-border flows of data in the context of education. So that's one way. The second way is that even when it comes to, that degree courses. So for example, we don't yet know how the MBA program at the Smith School will evolve. But already conversations are taking place at the Smith School, but I know conversations are taking place from some of my friends who are on the faculty at Harvard Business School about what's the future of, in terms of the structure of the MBA education. Should it be that you still have on campus, but it could be on campus online, but on campus taught by the school's own faculty courses, but at the same time, certain courses, which may be more technical, a more structured learning, that you could make them as prerequisites, that students coming into the MBA program need to do those on their own through these specific MOOCs, and that take some kind of qualifying exams. So that's another way in which, so even for degree-taking students, that maybe what they do from the school's own faculty is somewhat less in terms of the total number of credit hours, and some of those credits take place through MOOCs. But then, and the third way, probably, more than probably, very likely, and it's already happening, is that, for example, next year, academic year 2020, 2021, that as I teach, so I'll be teaching a course in global strategy, that, and of course, I have friends who are, professors of strategy and globalization around the world, that, and we share our course syllabi, our approaches, our favorite cases, our favorite pedagogical methods, and so on. And that's, again, is a kind of, if you will, data flow. But what that happens is that what I teach in the fall, or what a friend of mine might teach at London Business School, that it has both, it has become better because we spoke to each other. So therefore, I still teach, Smith students, and my friend teaches London Business School students, but what we teach and how we teach now has become, let's say, somewhat better because we shared our ideas. So these are some of the ways, I think, in which higher education, particularly business education, is getting affected and will keep getting affected.
And it sounds like it fits your positive view about globalization as well, that in many ways, the future of globalization continues to strengthen higher education in the aggregate, as well as even locally. That's great news. We had a question very early on from David Hughes, who's in the International Business Department of the University of South Carolina. First, he says thank you, but he also asked if you could comment on how food security and water security are affected by these new models of globalization. And he continues, I'll just give you all the questions at once. And will these changes in the next 25 years induce more intensified regional trade blocs? I think this is a question that's come up many times, at least in the conversations I've had. And to reduce the risks, that is, and as well as to the country's national security concerns. So the idea is, you know, will we revert to more regional blocs? And the last part of the question is, does compel a rise in wages and prices as a function of the new alignment of competition? So it's a rather complex question, but I think you've woven answers throughout your presentation. You want to tackle this?
Yeah, indeed. And I think start from some of the very kind of almost like definitive predictions one can make, which is that regional blocs, from a trade point of view, will indeed become more salient as compared to cross-regional flows. And here I'm talking about, once again, the old, if you will, linkages, which is trade, merchandise trade. So that kind of, yes, regional blocs. And what will fuel that is, number one, security. And and food security is one aspect of that. Medical security is another aspect of that. Technological security is a third aspect of that. So therefore, yes, in terms of regional merchandise trade blocs will become more salient. But on the other hand, if we talk about digital flows, data flows, so we may still have regional or local production of food or medical products. But at the same time, we will have multinational companies. And those multinational companies will be producing those goods within those regions. And there'll be a lot more trade within regions. But at the same time, what will flow across these, kind of cross-regional production centers, if you will be data flows and capital flows. So, so that would be kind of at a macro level. Now coming specifically to food and water, that, obviously food has both, the raw materials and then processing. It's easy to imagine that processing will take place within regional blocks, but production of food ultimately depends really on the natural, if you will, endowments. So Brazil, a powerhouse when it comes to meat or sugar or corn. And so once again, it depends on natural endowments of a region. And that will continue, but at the same time, countries or other regions, large countries or regions will be very keen to figure out, are already keen, but will become increasingly keen to figure out how to increase or reduce the risk and increase food security by locating it within regions. When it comes to water, that's a different question, because water issues typically tend to, of course, they are global in the sense of climate, and the global warming. And so obviously global warming affects all countries around the world in terms of extreme weather patterns. And that affects, once again, what happens to, for example, rainwater and how much of it can be absorbed versus being washed away. Otherwise, water issues tend to be much more local in the sense of India, Pakistan, India, China, rather than India, US. And those issues have been there for decades, and those issues will continue to be there for decades.
Okay, thank you for that, Anil. The questions are flowing in, and I'm trying to recognize that we probably won't get through them all. So I'm going to try to combine several. There's a series of questions that I think, looking ahead at this new globalization, a set of questions that are asking about the risks of that. And in particular, one that stands out is you started the conversation by talking a little bit about inequality and the implications of globalization in terms of inequality, the old globalization. But what about the new globalization? What are the implications for potentially for inequality? But there's a second question from a different person that also asks about the environment and whether or not you see any potential implications on that side.
Yeah, I think inequality that is getting worse. I talked about inequality in the beginning of my presentation, that how it is in fact becoming more severe. And the digitization, and on top of that, the current coronavirus pandemic has accelerated the inequality or the severity of inequality because, what digitization does, it increases the power, if you will, the share of economic value added by the big tech giants. And so as Amazon, as an example, rises and becomes more powerful, a lot of small retailers, even mid-sized retailers, not only risk dying, in fact, it's not current that they may just die and never be able to recover from this situation. And obviously, a lot of the workers, who are not really producers of digital goods, but they are producers of physical goods. And those jobs, as those jobs go away, so for example, in the US, Secretary Mnuchin talked about that unemployment could hit 20% this year, sometime this year, maybe in this current quarter. But that it's not just that unemployment may hit 20%, but even after we have recovered from this virus, 40% of those jobs may never come back. Could it therefore be that next year, 2021, we are still looking at a 10% unemployment, which is horrendous in the US, that we could see similar situations play out in other parts of the world, be that Europe, be that China, be that India, etc. And so therefore, so two things I think, unfortunately, we can predict is, number one, unemployment, even 2021, 2022, is likely to be high. And number two is that even the people who are employed, that the wage gaps in terms of between them and, let's say, the top rungs, the top 10% of the employees or the CEO, I think that ratio is likely to be higher. So yes, inequality, digitization, inequality, growth of inequality, Thomas Piketty, so that's been driven by just capitalism, so it's a side effect of capitalism, and that's been going on for decades. But digitization just makes it worse, and the coronavirus has made it even worse.
Thank you. I wish the answer to that question was a bit more positive, but it is what it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Neil? There are a series of questions, Neil, about the organization in the context of this accelerating digital globalization. One question revolves around what the question asker believes you've indicated, and that is some degree of centralization in large companies of data structures and other types of organizational structures. Other questions have come in about this remote work, as you indicated, a driver for some of these data flows, and what some of the risks organizationally are of that kind of work. But then a last question is, what does this mean potentially in terms of the global strategy overall of multinational companies? For example, how does this affect the way they innovate? How does this affect the strategy as it relates to digitization? I know that's a lot, but if you could just focus a little bit more on the global company, as well as potentially some regional ones and even how it might affect the more local companies, that would be great.
Yeah. So let me, so one was about distributed work and how that plays out. So I think clearly, and Twitter is a good example of, it's a leading edge example. Other companies may not necessarily say we are going to do what Twitter has decided to do, but that's an indicator of at least the trend in which things will flow, which is that Jack Dorsey, was it yesterday or day before, but sometime in the last 2-3 days, he said that this work from home, which we had instituted temporarily because of the coronavirus, now we are as a policy making it permanent. That all Twitter employees forever now, in fact, are encouraged to work from home. That you come into an office space only if you need to. And of course, there are important reasons that one can think of why people would need to physically meet. So it's not that physical meetings or proximity dies completely, but the market share of remote work absolutely will increase dramatically. And so we have to embrace that. But that also means once you embrace remote work, you embrace it not just distributed within the country, but naturally distributed across countries. And that will raise questions that companies, corporate leaders they're already paying attention to, which is, of course, not only how do you keep the employee engaged, so that's number one, but number two is data security and IP security, in terms of know-how, technologies, and so on. So those solutions naturally, even over these 2 months, companies have been trying to figure that out. And so, and they will figure it out because, we know that the world hasn't come to a stop. Even over these 2 months, it has slowed down dramatically. It hasn't come to a stop, and the big tech hasn't come to a stop. So that's my perspective on this. In terms of the multinational, what the future, if you will, not of globalization, but the future of multinationals. If I take, for instance, let's say some examples. So let's take Walmart. So, and so I use the, Michael Porter language of multi-domestic, or we could say multi-regional or multi-local. That a company like Walmart, obviously, given the nature of retail, has been a multi-domestic, but a global company. And so you have operations, Walmart stores around the world, but it's not that they are not connected to each other. They're connected to each other really by know-how, by practices, by capital. But that kind of a multi-domestic corporation where you have local for local, regional for regional, but connected by data, now is also moving into the arena of manufacturing. So you look at Tesla, for example, a gigaplant in Shanghai, a gigaplant coming up in Berlin, and I'm sure over the next 5 years, Elon Musk would be setting up gigaplants in other places around the world. And so you will have production in China for China, in Europe for Europe, and so on, in Latin America for Latin America. And as that happens, naturally, you will have a multinational physical goods company. Naturally, Tesla is not just a physical good, it's also digital goods and digital services. But so I think whether it's in the domain of old retail or new retail, look at Amazon. Amazon is worldwide. But there's not, there is some cross-border trading of physical goods, but that's not really, that's at the margins. The real Amazon, in terms of e-commerce globalization story, is local for local or regional for regional, but then connected by data. So, if you look at the harbingers of tomorrow, in terms of the multinational, look at Walmart, look at Amazon, look at Tesla. So look at, of course, at Netflix. So these are, to me, the exemplars of the multinational company of tomorrow.
As you were answering the question, a new one came in that perhaps I'll just ask you to quickly address since we're on the subject. But the question is, do you think the gig economy as you know, because several of the examples that you might think of in the digital economy are sort of drivers of growth in the gig or on-demand economy. Do you see that rising as a consequence of this new kind of globalization?
Yes. So in certain sectors, I think the gig economy is suffering, but its suffering doesn't mean it will die or dying. And in certain other sectors, the gig economy actually has continued to thrive and will thrive even more. So the one area where the gig economy has definitely suffered is ride sharing, Uber, Didi, Lyft, Ola, because obviously if people are staying at home, they're not moving around. And so that, and we can see from all of the, what has happened to the stock price of these companies and what, they are doing in terms of laying off people, even at the senior levels. So yes, the ride-sharing gig economy has suffered a lot. But then, if we wake up, a year from now, 2 years from now, would we go back to people driving their own cars? Absolutely no way. So in fact, the gig economy, even in ride-sharing, will come back. I mean, we don't yet know how much people will be moving around. But we know that people will be moving around a lot more than they are today. And that moving around will be in terms of the share of driving yourself versus, having, calling an Uber or a Lyft or a Didi or Ola. I think that will be higher, that share. The one area where actually the gig economy has not suffered at all is in terms of, like the Uber Eats model, the Grubhub model, where, okay, now obviously individual companies may be in trouble. So Uber Eats is in trouble, but Grubhub is not in trouble. But that's more an intra-industry competition. Somebody wins, somebody loses. But at the industry's level, in terms of, the delivery from the restaurant, delivery from the grocery store to my home, that kind of, it's again an important part of it. That has not suffered. In fact, that has thrived over the last 2-3 months, and that will continue. If you look at a gig economy in terms of office work, I think that part, as office work gets distributed, the gig economy itself becomes a globally distributed. So I think I firmly believe that the gig economy, that's a secular trend. It will be bigger, more important a year from now than it is today. But some segments, certainly for short term, if you will, few months, are taking a hit, ride sharing in particular.
Great, thanks. Well, we'll do 2 more questions. One is about policy. As is the case in the flow of goods, this can be restricted by policy efforts. Data can be restricted, as we know, by policies and investments that nations can make, even companies can make. And I'm wondering if you see this as a new sort of battleground for protectionism in ways that might limit the benefits of this kind of globalization from actually taking hold.
That is a bit of a question mark, although I do have a prediction. And when I say a bit of a question mark, because especially when we talk about the nationalism or data nationalism, that it's really much more, and it's connected to data privacy, and it's much more around individual data. Okay, so, here, of course, we're not talking about China versus the rest of the world. Okay, so because that's a unique case in terms of, let's call it hard data nationalism. Okay, but China is not the rest of the world. China is obviously the second most important country, second most important economy in the world. But even then, China's GDP is, around 16% or so of the world's GDP. Even 30 years from now, China's GDP won't be more than 22% of the world's GDP. So yes, what China does is very important, but it doesn't define what the rest of the world does. And if you look at the rest of the world, that GDPR, for example, it doesn't prohibit data flows. It talks about protecting individual privacy. But as long as you're doing that, data flows cross-border are permitted. India, for the last 2 years, they have been debating, implementing a proposed bill towards hard data nationalism. But then Mr. Modi, instead of, let's say, saying, okay, let's do it, let's implement it, has essentially put it on the shelf. Because at the same time, if you look at the big, global tech giants, Facebook and Google and Apple and Amazon, for instance, they are massive in India. And they are part of not just daily life, they're part of public life in terms of they're part of how the government does its business. And so therefore the government sees that there are, yes, reasons to engage in data nationalism, but at the same time reasons not to, and the government is in two minds, and so basically that bill has been on the shelf. So I think that yes, countries will and should try to protect individual privacy, and that will curb certain types of data from flowing across borders. But other than that, lots of other, like know-how, for example, science, technology, data that increases the productivity of factories. All of that, let's call it economically important data. I don't see, other than China in some respects, I don't see any country talking about that kind of data nationalism.
Thank you for that. And Neil, very quickly, since we're down to 2 or 3 minutes, we had a question because many of our viewers are scholars, as you are. And they're wondering if you could give maybe just 2 or 3 quickly ideas about where you think the biggest questions are for scholars moving forward. Where do we need to better understand digital globalization in order to make for a better world?
Yeah, so I mean, I think some of the issues, questions that I have addressed in my earlier work, I think they probably become more important, which is, because some of the most economically important data is data around R&D, science and technology. So issues about R&D location choice become more important. Issues about diffusion of know-how within companies and across companies, they become more important. So those would definitely be some questions. But it would also be interesting, perhaps, to look at those questions across 2 types of companies or 2 types of industries. One is that are pure, let's say, digital companies. And the second is companies, let's say, like Nike, which are, historically, even today, dominantly in physical goods, but their physical goods and now also have digital components, digital services attached to them. So, how do we see knowledge flows and data flows play out as complements, as parallels to goods flows within those companies?
Right. Well, we've come to the end of our time together. For me, it felt like it just flew by, and I think that's because the content, the ideas, the insights that you shared, Anil, are both very powerful and very relevant to the kinds of things that we do at GBSN, but also our viewers. So thank you so much, Anil, for this time. Thank you to the Smith School, Christine and Rebecca. We appreciate your engagement and support for GBSN over the years. And for everybody who's dialed in, look for the recording at some point in the very near future. And if you want more information about GBSN, just visit us online at gbsn.org. Again, thank you, Anil. This has been great. We appreciate the insights that you shared with us this morning.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan. Pleasure for me. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Christine. Bye.